Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/WTech. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Washington Tech Policy Podcast, episode number 10.
Moving the needle. Welcome to the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
Curating communications, media, and tech policy news so you don't have to. News, interviews, everything you need without the axe to grind. It's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
The EU drops criminal charges against Ed Snowden. The IRS is in the mobile surveillance game now. And Courtney Tanenbaum joins us today. European Court of Justice Commissioner Vera Jourova says the EU and US have agreed in principle on a new data protection framework to replace the safe harbor the EU Court of Justice struck down in early October. The EU deems US data protection laws as insufficient to protect Europeans' data from the US government. For 15 years, the safe harbor allowed US tech firms to overcome that presumption. Now that the safe harbor no longer exists, the US government has been working feverishly to work out a new framework. Last Thursday in Frankfurt, U.S. Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker urged EU officials to put a new framework in place, saying, quote, "This is an urgent problem with a sensible solution in the improved safe harbor framework we have negotiated with our European Commission partners over the past 2 years," end quote. Commissioner Jourova will be visiting the U.S. next week. Pritzker is hoping the visit will be a milestone in the negotiations. Today, Tuesday, November 3rd, 2015, the House will be holding 2 hearings on what to do now that the EU has invalidated the safe harbor. The first will take place before the Energy and Commerce Committee at 10 a.m. in Rayburn 2123, with Victoria Espinel, President and CEO of the Business Software Alliance, among others who are scheduled to testify. The second will take place at 1 p.m. before the House Judiciary Committee, with Espinel as well as Robert Atkinson of ITIF, among others, who are scheduled to testify, and that will take place in 2141 Rayburn. So that's 10 a.m. Energy and Commerce, Rayburn 2123, and 1 p.m. Judiciary, Rayburn 2141. The EU also last week vindicated the person responsible for all the hoopla around data protection, Edward Snowden, who continues to shed light on America's mass surveillance practices. Saying that Snowden is a whistleblower and human rights defender, the European Parliament has dropped its charges against Snowden, offering him asylum in Europe. Americans, on the other hand, want Snowden extradited from Moscow to stand trial for espionage. After the EU released the report, Snowden tweeted, "This is not a blow against the U.S. government, but an open hand extended by friends. It is a chance to move forward," end quote. In Germany, Hamburg's data protection officer Johannes Kaspar told the German magazine Der Spiegel that Germany is investigating data transfers Google and Facebook made from Germany into the U.S. Kaspar said, quote, "Anyone who wants to remain untouched by the legal and political implications of the judgment should in the future consider storing personal data only on servers within the European Union," end quote. The EU has also released a draft net neutrality bill. The Hill reports that tech companies, including Netflix and Reddit, are opposing the bill, saying it would allow ISPs to arbitrarily slow web traffic. Here in the U.S., The Guardian reports the IRS bought Stingray equipment to track individuals' mobile phones. The newspaper reports a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered invoices showing the agency spent over $70,000 on Stingray equipment. Apple filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court asking it to review a June Second Circuit $450 million ruling against it. The lower court held Apple must pay $450 million to consumers for conspiring on pricing with 5 book publishers, including Hachette Book Group, HarperCollins, Penguin, Simon & Schuster, and Macmillan. The FAA has launched a task force to create a national drone registry. Google X, Best Buy, GoPro, Amazon, and the Consumer Electronics Association will join 20 other task force members from the public and private sectors. Solar storms are on the White House's OSTP's agenda. Last week, OSTP released a 44-page plan for dealing with space weather that could potentially affect telecommunications here on Earth. They are looking to implement the plan within the next 2 years. Missouri Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill put TracFone on blast at last week's confirmation hearing for FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. TracFone has been accused of violating the Lifeline program, which is designed to provide affordable phone service to low-income households. The FCC fined TracFone $100 million, but TracFone still hasn't paid the fine, and McCaskill wants to know why, since TracFone still gets subsidies. TracFone denies liability, saying the fine was disproportionate to decades of fines levied on other companies for similar violations. CISA, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, passed the Senate last week and now heads to the House amid opposition from the tech sector, as well as privacy groups who see the bill as a backdoor surveillance bill rather than one that deals with keeping the nation's infrastructure secure. Telecom companies such as AT&T favor the bill. So does the White House. White House spokesman Eric Schultz said President Obama is encouraged that CISA passed the Senate. Some experts are saying the House could vote on the bill by the end of January. The FCC has released a 30-page report and order, including appendices, which outlines the agency's proposed broadcast incentive auction process. Ashley Ludlow and Davina Shashkin of the law firm Fletcher, Heald & Hildreth have prepared a great summary of the public notice, which you can find at comlawblog.com. The FCC released its November 19th open meeting agenda. The commission will vote on an NPRM that would improve the effectiveness of wireless emergency alerts, a report and order and NPRM to update the scope of hearing aid compatibility, and a second report and order to improve the accessibility of user interfaces of video programming platforms. Finally, Congress and the White House now have a budget deal, and the draft includes parameters requiring the FCC and Commerce Department to report on how they would free up over 130 megahertz of spectrum over the next 10 years. For you, my dear listeners of the Washington Tech Policy Podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. You'll be amazed at how much reading you'll get done using Audible. Audible even has notes and bookmarking features, so you can find your spot later on if you're preparing a citation. You can listen wherever you are. I just ramped up my morning routine and turn on Audible when I'm on my morning run, or even when I'm on the metro. How about The Innovators by Walter Isaacson? You can download The Innovators or another audiobook free by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at audibletrial.com/WTech. My guest today is Dr. Courtney Tanenbaum, Senior Researcher at American Institutes for Research, AIR. She holds a master's degree in Education Policy and Leadership from the University of Maryland, an Ed.D. of Higher Education Administration from GW, and an A.B. in Art History from Harvard. Dr. Tanenbaum's research focuses on engaging historically disadvantaged groups of students in STEM education and career pathways. Specifically, her work has examined the factors that affect education and career aspirations in STEM, including students' academic and social integration into these disciplines, science identity development, and the implicit biases that can lead to differential treatment and encouragement in STEM pathways for disadvantaged youth. Welcome to the show, Courtney.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
So to start off, tell us something that you absolutely love about what you do.
I really love, first, my colleagues and also the people that I'm able to connect with through my research. Much of my research is done not just sitting behind the desk, but in the field. And that can be telephone interviews, but often it's visiting school sites, visiting communities, speaking with the students and the administrators and officials who really run programs around diversity and who have a keen interest in improving access to and opportunity in education and career pathways, and particularly in STEM. So I love, often I'm on a project right now where we've convened, I guess what we're terming thought leaders or experts in the field of STEM, but who come from all different sectors. So they could be academics, innovators, entrepreneurs, school administrators, teachers, and getting folks around the room to really talk about new ways of redesigning STEM education, how we're defining the formal and informal classrooms and the learning spaces, as well as the sort of bigger grand challenges around STEM and how you engage all communities, all students, all businesses in sort of a concerted common effort to make STEM more of a living reality and relevant for everybody who really does. STEM touches everything these days. So
yeah, and the first thing you said was that you like the people you work with, so that always helps.
It does. And then just hearing the voices of the people who are actually engaged in the work and who want the research, but really want to sort of push and use the research and find new ways of doing research that can really improve these pathways for students and engage more students. So what that means and how we redefine and adapt to kind of the 21st century STEM, which is different than it was many, many years ago when we didn't have the technological advances that we do today. And so things are really rapidly changing, and how we adapt to that and how we can build on that and leverage new technologies to really improve the pathways for folks.
Yeah, and that's really important here in Washington, because I feel like here we're kind of detached from what's happening actually in the community. So it's great that you're in a role where you can actually meet with folks on the ground and get a sense for exactly what their needs are and really kind of work here in town to make it happen for them.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think one thing that often gets missed is that, when you talk to people who are in different communities and different locations and geographic regions, both, within DC, and then if you think in the broader nation, the challenges that they face and how they use STEM and the STEM in their environments. So that's, the local resources, the local issues they're trying to solve, whether they be environmental or economic or anything like that. They have great ideas, and they're often using technology in ways, or could use technology in ways, and have a local knowledge that's really critical. That often those voices get ignored or not even really addressed or solicited when they should be. So I think that's really a fun part of my job, is when I can hear those voices. What gets more challenging is getting those voices out there to the people who really need to hear them.
So you said something interesting in one of the interviews I saw of you. You were talking about women being discouraged in STEM, and that we should be thinking more about that lack of encouragement as being basically in and of itself discouragement. And I thought that was a key insight. Can you describe a little bit more about how you came to that conclusion?
Sure. So there is a lot of research out there right now, particularly around women. And I think this also actually is relevant to any underrepresented group in STEM, where there's an assumption about who does STEM. There's kind of that traditional image of the white male scientist that really persists, and that we see over and over again in the media, in Hollywood. And although some things are starting to change, that really is the image that's still out there. And those sorts of biases or implicit kind of cultural signals that affect all of us are internalized by folks who have been underrepresented in groups of individuals, like women, like minorities, and also in lower socioeconomic status communities, where they could be doing very well in science and math, but they don't see that as a feasible pathway necessarily, and so they can be easily discouraged. And they often need, some of the research shows that it's often one teacher, or when you hear stories of individuals who have persisted, it's one teacher or one mentor or a colleague that says, "Wow, you're really good at this." And often underrepresented groups need that just little push of encouragement of saying, "No, you can do this, and this is how I can help you," or, "You're really a superstar here, and this is something you should pursue." And that often doesn't get said.
And you've also done some work looking at stereotype threat, a concept that was pioneered by Claude Steele. I think he was teaching at Stanford at the time. And stereotype is, the notion that minorities' performance on things like standardized tests is lessened when they feel like they're going to confirm a stereotype that they won't do well in math, for example, even though written numerals were created by the Egyptians, but we won't get into that.
Right.
And some of Steele's studies involved reminding subjects that they were minorities before a test, while not reminding students in the control group, and that the students who were reminded that they were minorities ended up performing less well. Am I roughly in the ballpark on that?
Right. Yep, exactly. And it's
then
really interesting. Right.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, you also write a lot about imposter syndrome, the Clance and Imes's work when they had at Georgia State. And their work showed that high achievers, particularly women, at some point along the way feel like they're imposters, or that they are intellectual phonies, which is how Clance and Imes described in their paper many years ago. But I have to tell you, to this day, I experience stereotype threat, and but how do I talk about it without bringing up stereotypes? In any case, if I'm late for something like a meeting or something like that, even though others are late, I often feel like my lateness might be attributed to my race. Or on the other hand, I also experience imposter syndrome. Like, who am I to try and start my own business in as competitive a city as Washington, D.C.? So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the best practices people can use when they start experiencing stereotype threat or imposter syndrome?
Yeah, and that's a really tough question, because I think the folks that I've connected with around these issues, it's hard to know how to proceed, because you want to mitigate and address these issues and these factors and experiences in a way that's positive and that doesn't, like you said, sort of reintroduce the stereotype. And I think I don't have one strategy that I know works, and it might be unique a little bit to an individual. I think a strategy that needs to be used more widely, and I'm seeing more and more of this, especially at the higher education levels, where they're using it in terms of faculty hires. But having within an organization or a business or a community some discussion around subconscious and implicit biases and these, like, what stereotype threat is, what imposter syndrome is, because chances are we can't totally eliminate bias or stereotype threat or those sorts of experiences or feelings of imposter syndrome. But having a community or a sort of common understanding of these experiences, that they're out there, that people experience these, and that there's also ways that the people who don't experience these in the company or the organization or the culture can help mitigate that by being aware of their own biases and then taking steps to address them, or even just at least acknowledge them, so that it's more of an open discussion. And these can help mitigate those sorts of factors and the comments that might be made. Just make it sort of more of a community effort, like almost like a professional learning community where this is brought to bear and talked about in a more open way.
And so academia, it's a topic you've spoken and written very passionately about. You once said that a lack of diversity in STEM academia sends cultural signals that constrain choices.
Right.
Could you go into detail about that? Could you point listeners to a few statistics on women and minorities in STEM academic positions?
Sure. And I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but it's crazy low. And it really is, it's hard to talk about STEM, well, particularly for female minorities. I mean, often it's not even, oh gosh, I think it's something like less than 2%. Oh, I won't get the statistic right now, but it's so low. And often the cell sizes, once you break it down to the individual discipline, are so low that the statistics can't even be reported. It's like a negative or it's just like a zero or not, it can't be reported because you could end up identifying somebody. So it's no longer confidential if there's, one Native American woman who's a tenured faculty at a research institution. So those numbers have to change. And that's not to say that everybody has to be, a researcher or a tenured professor at a division, at a high tiered, research intensive university. But the paucity of, having no one in those positions really does sense. It's one piece of the one cultural signal among many that just kind of perpetuates this cycle of underrepresentation, or the types of pathways that students find. If they don't have anybody to look up to or see in those positions, why would they ever imagine themselves there? Or it's very hard to imagine themselves there. And it's very hard within that top community for them to imagine somebody like that in their community, because people tend to hire and tend to promote and tend to advance people who look like them, who they're comfortable with. So it's sort of this chicken and egg issue of, we need to get the numbers up, but how do you get the people there, and how do you expand the talent pool? And I think that gets back to your earlier point, lack of encouragement. There needs to be more efforts to encourage that talent, because that might be just that one word or that one sort of push that can really move the needle on this issue.
And you have an amazing art history background in addition to the policy work that you've been doing for over a decade now here in Washington. How does art play a role in STEM? Do you see, sometimes you hear people talking about now STEAM, STEA, the A being for arts and M. Do you see a role for the arts and not just in STEM, but do you see a role for more creative thinking in policymaking here in Washington?
Definitely. So I think one challenge that we have moving forward in terms of policy and in terms of thinking about STEM is actually, if there's any way to get rid of the acronym STEM, that would be fantastic. I'd love to see us get to a place where STEM is not a unit in and of itself. It's just thread throughout, because it's so interdisciplinary. And I love that you brought up art and art history. I mean, art is always sort of a translation and reflection of what the world or the social and political context at the time. And you think about during the during the Industrial Revolution and things like that. There was art that pictured that used that as its sort of source and its muse to a certain extent. And I think there's just no way to divorce technology from creative thinking, from art. I mean, that's, so much technology is now used to create art and different forms of art. So I think before we start adding to the acronym and doing STEAM or STEM plus C for the computer sciences, if there's a way to just rethink and re-articulate what STEM really is, because it's such an ambiguous term and there's so many nuances in it. And there's so many places from early childhood all the way through lifelong, beyond education, our formal education. People are learning and using STEM, and that's going to continue as we move forward.
And comic book characters. You were a comic book fan growing up?
Oh, I've become one since having a 4-year-old boy, I guess.
Yeah, and you tweeted one thing about comic books, and so now you have to talk all the time about comic books.
Yes. Well, I will say that I did read some comic books, but more of like the Archies growing up. I grew up in a household of girls. And although I did watch shows like He-Man and things like that, I wouldn't say that I was a huge superhero fan growing up, but over the past year or so, I've become one. And also seen how much in looking at my son and his friends and their sort of, and this includes the girls as well, it's become such a little part of their culture that they act like superheroes. They pretend they are superheroes. They read about them. They imagine and they play and they make up games that use superheroes. And that's made me realize how important it is for kids at that young of an age to have superheroes, both those, I guess, in the comic books and outside of comic books, who they look up to, who they love, who they have a lot of fun with, that look like them, that they can relate to, that they can actually play and be Spider-Man or be Superman or Wonder Woman. Because I'm concerned, or I do worry, that there's not enough diversity in how those superheroes look and what they do in the communities they live in. And every child should have somebody that they can play and role play with and not feel like they're doing so as, to get back into a term we were using earlier, imposter.
Right.
My son will come home and be like, I was Spider-Man today, or I'm Spider-Man today.
Right. Yeah, my daughters love Spider-Man, and I've made sure of it.
Right. I guess I would just hate for a child to come home and be like, I wish I could be Spider-Man, versus just the statement of, I am Spider-Man today.
Right. Right, exactly. And and that's what you tweeted, that all kids should be able to see themselves as superheroes. Do you see the comic book scene as sort of an affinity group for kids who are successful in STEM? Do you see what are some of the affinity groups out there that kids who are really interested and really perform well in STEM gravitate towards?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I feel like that's a research project. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, but if you think about what's available for kids in STEM and starting early in the early exposure, I mean, I know, like Legos, for example, like the Lego community. And then you think about the games that I can't speak too knowledgeable about this, except for I have nephews who adore it, is Minecraft. So, I mean, there's so many ways out there for kids at young ages to access and engage in STEM. The kids who are in Minecraft, they're building, they're being creative, they're tinkering, they're learning how to fail and start over again and learn from their mistakes. And that's, this isn't really answering your question, but to get into another sort of topic or something that I think is critical, especially in the early childhood years, is that early childhood and games and gaming, they're designed to let kids, they're supposed to kind of learn as they go, and they try new things, and sometimes it doesn't work, and then they learn from it, and they persist, and they keep going, and they're engaged, and they want to do better. But they're not getting, and there's little sort of setbacks that they hit, when the blocks fall over, or the Lego kits, and they don't put it together the right way and have to start over again, or in games, they don't get to the next level, so they have to start again and keep moving their way through it. But they're not discouraged. They're motivated by that sort of failure, I guess, or that not doing it quite right the first time and learning to do it again. And that space is not often provided in schools. It's provided more in the early childhood years, but it becomes less so as students move through their curriculum and their coursework, where they end up, if they fail, they don't have a second chance, or the consequences are so punitive that it's discouraging, and they don't sort of own that as their own path. Yeah, I think that's critical. And so I think in terms of affinity groups, I think any affinity group could be engaged in STEM or could provide those skills or help develop those skills that are really critical to success in STEM. but it's more of making those affinity groups a little bit more intentional in how they introduce it and use it. So it doesn't have to be in their face, but so that there's some connection there and some relevance to, what I'm learning here, I can really take and adapt and flexibly apply in other situations like STEM learning situations.
Dr. Tanenbaum, it has truly been an honor having you on the show today.
Oh, thank you. It's been an honor to be here. I've enjoyed the conversation.
I just have a few final questions before we close.
Sure.
And that is, what is the last book you read that you felt compelled to recommend to everyone you met?
Okay, so this is going to be sort of an odd one because it's one I would never have thought of myself. But I recently read a science fiction book called The Diamond Age, and it's by Neil Stephenson. And I am not have not typically been a science fiction fan. I'm a pretty avid reader, but I don't usually pick up that genre. And someone recommended it to me, and it was one of the most compelling, thought-provoking books I have read, and particularly because it focuses on it's looking at a new way of educating students in sort of a fictional future age, and what that entails. And I won't articulate it well, but if anybody is interested in sort of a new vision for education and the opportunities that technology specifically could offer as we move into the future in terms of how we think about education and how students learn, and not just specific content, but to be flexible, adaptable, ethical citizens, it's an amazing read.
And we often hear a lot about the best career advice. What's the worst piece of career advice you've ever gotten, and why?
So that's a really good question. And I can't say, I might flip it a little bit to say that I don't know that I've ever gotten any terrible career advice, but I'm not sure I've always gotten the advice that I would have liked to had. So I think this actually gets back to the lack of encouragement, sort of the lack of advice. There's a lot of knowledge out there for people who have gone through their careers that needs to be shared, I think, with people who are starting out. So some advice that I wish I had gotten earlier on was to use my voice, to vocalize what I'm thinking. Like, I think, and this is probably true for a lot of individuals who may be underrepresented in a community or in a job in a company, is that it's really important to voice your ideas, your aspirations, your goals, or even your uncertainties, because too often people's voice, they're silent. And if you don't share your insights, people don't know what you have to offer. So I'd say, without being the really annoying squeaky wheel, one thing I wish I had learned early on was that my thoughts are important and my perspectives are important. And just because I'm new doesn't mean that my voice shouldn't be heard. The more you can vocalize what you want and where you're coming from, the more people are going to remember you, are going to leverage your knowledge and your perspectives. So I think that's one advice I would give, is that you have an important voice no matter where you stand in an organization or a company.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with fear. And, it's so, you're afraid to say what's on your mind. But then once you do it, you figure out it's not so bad at all. And you just keep building from there. So and my final question is, what's a productivity secret you'd like to share? It doesn't have to be complex. It can be a tool or a habit, just something you do every day that keeps you on top of your game.
One thing I do is I make sure I have time for myself. My work is really important for me, and I'm very passionate about it. And often my personal and professional life blend in terms of my perspective and my interactions with people. But I would not be good at my job, and I would not be productive at my job if I didn't carve out really specific pieces of time to be with my family, to take care of myself, to eat, to walk, to do yoga, those sorts of things. That actually really keeps me on the ball. I think often too many people just get sort of tunnel visioned. And there's always a task that can be accomplished at any time. But putting that aside, taking care of myself, and then getting into work really does help.
Dr. Tanenbaum, it has truly been an honor having you on the show today.
Great. Thank you so much for the time and the opportunity to speak with you and with your audience.
That was Courtney Tanenbaum, senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research, which you can find at air.org. You can find Courtney on Twitter at Court Tanenbaum. And that concludes episode 10 of the podcast. Thanks so much to all of you for listening. I cannot do any of this without you, so thank you. If you're new to the podcast, or even if you've been listening for a while, I have a free cheat sheet for all of my new email subscribers, and you can find the sign up for that at washingtech.com/cheat sheet. And that cheat sheet is a guide for you to get up to speed on various different policy areas, including cybersecurity, intellectual property, net neutrality, and other areas. It's a quick reference anytime you're preparing for a meeting or writing something you need citations for. That's washingtech.com/cheat sheet. Thanks again to all of you for listening. I'll see you back here next week. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. You've been briefed.